The freight train groaned to a stop somewhere outside Königsberg, metal wheels screeching against frozen rails, releasing a cloud of white steam into the bitter January air of 1946. 7-year-old Klaus Hartmann pressed his small, trembling body against the wooden slats of the cattle car, peering through a gap no wider than his finger at a landscape of ash and snow. His lungs burned with each shallow breath. His stomach, hollow and tight, no longer rumbled. It had forgotten how to speak after 3 weeks without real food. Around him, in the shadows of the unheated wagon, 11 other children huddled together for warmth, their faces grey, their eyes dull, their lips cracked and bleeding. Klaus did not cry. He could not remember the last time he had cried. Tears required moisture, and his body had none left to spare. Outside, soldiers shouted in Russian, the sound of boots on gravel, the metallic click of rifles. Klaus's hand found the small bundle tied to his waist, a torn shirt wrapped around a piece of black bread so hard it could break teeth. It was all he had left of home. Of his mother, who had whispered instructions into his ear before fever took her voice forever. Go to Lithuania, find food, come back, stay alive. She had been dead 4 days when he finally left her body behind in the rubble of what had been their cellar. If stories like this move you as deeply as they move me, subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. These forgotten stories deserve to live again, and your voice helps make that happen. Before the war, Klaus Hartmann had been a child of routines and small pleasures. His father, Friedrich, worked as a postal clerk in Königsberg, sorting letters and parcels with methodical precision in the Hauptpostamt on Steindamm Street. His mother, Helene, mended clothes for neighbors and sang folk songs while preparing evening meals. Potato soup with onions, rye bread with butter, sometimes smoked herring on Sundays. Klaus attended the neighborhood Volksschule, where he learned arithmetic and penmanship, and on Saturday afternoons he played with wooden soldiers in the courtyard of their apartment building. He had never traveled farther than the Baltic coast, never imagined a world beyond the cobblestone streets and church spires of his city. He did not understand politics or ideology. He knew only the warmth of his mother's lap, the smell of fresh bread, the comfort of a bed that did not move. Then in January 1945, the horizon turned red. Soviet forces launched a massive offensive into East Prussia, and the world Klaus knew disintegrated in a matter of days. His father was conscripted into the Volkssturm, the last desperate reserve of old men and boys, and disappeared into the smoke of a defensive line that collapsed within hours. Klaus and his mother joined a desperate exodus westward, fleeing in temperatures that plunged to 20 degrees below zero. But the roads were clogged with refugees, and Red Army tanks moved faster than frozen feet could carry families. They turned back toward Königsberg, now encircled and under siege. Inside the city, the bombs fell like iron rain. Buildings collapsed. Water pipes froze and burst. Food supplies vanished. By March, the city had surrendered and occupation began. Disease spread through the ruins faster than fire. Typhus, dysentery, starvation. Klaus's mother grew weaker each day, her skin turning translucent, her breathing shallow and labored. She gave him every scrap of food she could find, chewing leather straps to extract imaginary nutrients, boiling tree bark into a grey broth that tasted of nothing. She died in December 1945, her body so light Klaus could have carried her if there had been anywhere to take her. There were no funerals, no graves, only the cold and the silence and the terrible realization that he was alone. In the occupied territories of East Prussia, Soviet authorities implemented policies that sealed the fate of tens of thousands of German civilians. Russians were explicitly forbidden from taking in German children, branded as fascist offspring, unworthy of compassion. Those who survived the initial wave of violence and illness found themselves trapped in a wasteland where humanitarian aid did not exist. The region became a death trap for the vulnerable, the elderly, the disabled, and especially children. Official Soviet records from 1947 documented approximately 4,700 German children detained by military authorities, many of whom were subsequently deported under horrific conditions to Soviet orphanages. But these numbers represented only a fraction of the actual population of orphaned minors roaming the ruins. Estimates suggest that between 20,000 and 25,000 children were left to fend for themselves in the aftermath of the war, and their survival depended entirely on their own resourcefulness and on the mercy of strangers across a forbidden border. Klaus heard the rumors from older boys scavenging in the rubble. There was food in Lithuania. Farmers there still had bread, milk, potatoes. If you could cross the border, If you could reach a village, you might survive. The journey required riding the roofs of freight trains heading east, clinging to the tops of cattle cars through frozen nights, avoiding Soviet border patrols who shot first and asked no questions. It was madness, it was suicide, it was the only option. On a grey January morning, Klaus climbed onto a train departing from the Königsberg rail yard, his small fingers gripping the icy metal ridges of a boxcar roof. He was not alone. Other children, faces gaunt and eyes wild, clung to the same train, a desperate convoy of the forgotten. The train lurched forward, and the city disappeared behind a curtain of smoke and snow. For hours, Klaus lay flat against the roof, his body pressed against metal so cold it burned his skin through his threadbare coat. The wind tore at his face. His fingers went numb. He watched one boy lose his grip and fall, vanishing into the blur of tracks and gravel below, and Klaus forced himself to look away and hold tighter. The train stopped at checkpoints where Soviet soldiers searched for smugglers and deserters. Klaus and the other children would leap off before the train came to a full stop, scatter into the woods, and wait in silence until the train moved again, then sprint back and climb aboard as it gained speed. Sometimes they succeeded. Sometimes a child was too slow, too weak, too visible. Sometimes soldiers fired warning shots that were not warnings. When the train finally crossed into Lithuania, Klaus dropped off near a village whose name he never learned. His legs buckled beneath him when he tried to stand. His vision blurred. He stumbled toward the first farmhouse he saw, a low wooden structure with smoke rising from a stone chimney, and collapsed against the door. The door opened. A woman stood there, middle-aged, wearing a coarse woolen shawl, her face weathered by years of work and hardship. She looked down at Klaus with an expression he could not read. Not pity, not anger, something between fear and resignation. She spoke in Lithuanian, words he did not understand. Then she stepped aside and let him in. Inside, warmth. A fire crackling in a brick stove. The smell of boiled potatoes and cabbage. Klaus's legs gave out completely, and he crumpled onto the wooden floor. The woman brought him a tin cup of milk, still warm, and a piece of black bread. He ate slowly, his hands shaking so violently he spilled half the milk, tears finally streaming down his face, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming shock of kindness. This moment was repeated in hundreds of Lithuanian villages throughout 1946 and 1947. Lithuanian farmers, themselves living under Soviet occupation and facing their own deprivations, took in German children despite enormous risks. The Soviet authorities actively hunted for these children, and anyone caught harboring them faced arrest, deportation to labor camps or worse. Yet many Lithuanians chose compassion over compliance. They placed buckets of soup outside their doors at night, so children could eat without being seen. They gave the children new names, new identities, forging documents that claimed the orphans were Lithuanian-born to protect them from Soviet officials. By 1948, an estimated 45,000 German children had crossed into Lithuania, and thousands remained there permanently, integrated into families who treated them as their own. But Klaus did not stay. He could not. His mother's voice still echoed in his mind. Come back. He believed she was waiting for him. He did not yet understand that the dead do not wait. After 3 days in the farmhouse, where the woman fed him and washed his torn clothes and let him sleep by the fire, Klaus prepared to return to Königsberg. The woman tried to stop him. She held his shoulders and spoke urgently in Lithuanian, shaking her head, pointing west, then holding him as if to say, "Stay here." But Klaus was 7 years old, and he believed in promises, and he had promised his mother he would come back. He climbed back onto the death trains, that is what the children called them, Die Todeszüge, because so many who rode them never arrived. He made the journey 4 more times over the next 6 months, each trip more dangerous than the last. He carried food back to Königsberg in a cloth sack tied to his back, potatoes, turnips, sometimes a small sausage wrapped in paper. He shared it with other children living in the ruins, orphans like himself, who had not yet given up the fantasy that their parents might return. On his 5th trip in July 1946, Klaus nearly did not make it back. Soviet border guards stopped the train at a checkpoint and ordered everyone off. Klaus jumped from the roof and ran into the forest, his heart pounding, his lungs screaming, branches tearing at his face. He hid beneath a fallen log for hours, listening to soldiers shout and dogs bark, convinced that every snapping twig signaled his capture. When silence finally returned, he crawled out and waited by the tracks for another train. It came at dawn. He climbed aboard, his hands bleeding, his body shaking with exhaustion, and rode west once more. But when he returned to Königsberg, the cellar where he had lived was gone. Bulldozers had cleared the rubble. Soviet workers were constructing new buildings over the graves of the old city. The children he had known were scattered, deported or dead. Klaus stood in the empty lot where his mother had died, staring at dirt and concrete, and finally understood that there was nothing left to return to. He walked back to the rail yard and climbed onto an eastbound train one final time. This time he did not look back. The woman in the Lithuanian village took him in without hesitation when he appeared at her door again, thinner than before, silent and hollow-eyed. She gave him a new name, Kęstutis. She told the authorities he was her nephew, orphaned by the war, and presented forged documents that Soviet officials accepted without question because they were overwhelmed by the chaos of post-war bureaucracy. Klaus Hartmann ceased to exist. Kęstutis began. He worked on the farm, learning Lithuanian, forgetting German, burying his past beneath layers of survival and silence. He never spoke of Königsberg, never mentioned his real name, never told anyone about the trains, the cold, the bodies he had seen fall from rooftops and lie still in the snow. The woman who saved him never asked. She understood that some stories are too heavy to carry in words. For decades, the wolf children remained invisible. Soviet authorities refused to acknowledge their existence, and the children themselves stayed silent, terrified that revealing their German origins would lead to deportation or persecution. In Lithuania, under Soviet rule, the German language was the language of occupiers, and anyone associated with it faced suspicion and hostility. The children who had been saved learned to hide their identities so completely that many forgot who they had been. They became Lithuanian in name, language, and memory, their German childhoods erased like cities bulldozed into dust. Only in 1990, when Lithuania gained independence and the Soviet Union collapsed, did the silence begin to break. Grown men and women in their 50s and 60s started to speak publicly about their origins, revealing themselves as the Vokietukai, the little Germans who had ridden death trains and begged for bread in foreign villages. Historians like Ruth Lazarowicz began documenting their testimonies, piecing together a history that had been deliberately suppressed for half a century. Archives opened, photographs emerged, maps were drawn, showing the routes children had traveled, small lines crossing borders that had been guarded by men with guns. One of those testimonies came from a man who called himself Kęstutis, but had been born Klaus Hartmann in Königsberg in 1939. He was interviewed in 2003 by researchers documenting the wolf children phenomenon. He spoke slowly, carefully, as if testing the weight of words he had not used in 60 years. He described the trains, the cold, the woman who saved him. He showed the researchers a photograph, yellowed and creased, of a small boy standing beside a woman in a farmhouse doorway, both unsmiling, both looking directly at the camera with expressions that held no joy, only the quiet acknowledgement of survival. He died in 2008, buried under a Lithuanian name in a village cemetery, his gravestone bearing no mention of Königsberg or Germany. But his testimony remained, archived in the collections of the Museum of Occupations and Freedom Fights in Vilnius, part of a larger narrative finally being told. The story of Klaus Hartmann is not unique. It is one thread in a tapestry woven from thousands of similar journeys, children who rode rooftops through frozen nights, who knocked on doors in foreign villages, who were saved by strangers who had every reason to turn them away and chose not to. These children had no weapons, no power, no nation to claim them. They were simply small bodies trying to survive in a world that had decided they did not matter, but they did matter. Every life saved by a Lithuanian farmer was an act of rebellion against the machinery of hatred and dehumanization. Every child who lived to adulthood carried forward the memory of compassion that transcended nationality, ideology, and fear. The woman who took in Klaus Hartmann and renamed him Kęstutis risked everything, her safety, her family, her freedom, for a boy who was not her son, who spoke a language she despised, who represented a regime that had brutalized her country. Yet she fed him, sheltered him, loved him. This is the lesson buried in the rubble of Königsberg and the farmhouses of rural Lithuania, that humanity persists even when systems collapse, that kindness does not require permission, and that the smallest acts, a cup of milk, a piece of bread, a forged document, can mean the difference between erasure and existence. Klaus rode the death trains not because he was brave, but because starvation left no alternative. The woman opened her door not because she was a hero, but because a child was dying on her doorstep. Neither of them believed they were making history. They were simply trying to survive another day. Yet their choices echo across decades, reminding us that war is not only fought by soldiers and remembered in monuments, it is lived by children clinging to train roofs, by farmers hiding strangers in their homes, by mothers whispering final instructions to sons too young to understand what goodbye means. These are the forgotten narratives, the lives that slipped through the cracks of official memory because no one thought to record them, because survival left no time for documentation, because shame and fear silenced the witnesses. But silence does not erase truth. Klaus Hartmann existed. He suffered. He rode trains that should have killed him. He was saved by a woman whose name history never recorded, but whose decency shaped the course of one small life, and through that life, perhaps, the lives of descendants who now walk the earth because a door opened instead of staying closed. We owe these stories more than memory. We owe them recognition. That the war did not end in 1945 for children starving in occupied territories, that peace is not the absence of armies, but the presence of food and safety, and the chance to grow up without terror. We owe them the understanding that borders are lines drawn by men with maps, but hunger crosses all boundaries and compassion, when it emerges, does not ask for passports. Klaus Hartmann, who became Kęstutis, who rode death trains through frozen nights searching for bread, who lived to old age in a country that was not his birthplace but became his home, represents every forgotten civilian whose courage was never celebrated because it was not dramatic, whose survival was never honored because it was not convenient, whose humanity was never acknowledged because it complicated the narratives we prefer to tell. His story is a call to remember not only the fallen soldiers and the famous battles, but also the 7-year-old boy clinging to a train roof with bleeding hands, the woman who opened a door despite the danger, and the thousands of small, unrecorded moments when mercy triumphed over cruelty, when strangers chose life over indifference, and when the forgotten became, however briefly, seen. That is what history owes the wolf children. That is what we owe Klaus Hartmann. Not just remembrance, but the recognition that his life and the lives of all those like him mattered as much as any generals, any battle, any treaty. Because in the end, the measure of our humanity is not found in the monuments we build or the wars we win, but in the children we save, the doors we open, and the simple, profound choice to see a stranger not as an enemy, but as a child in need of bread.